The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Montana's ranch country, where the mighty Rocky Mountains stood like ancient sentinels against the endless sky. Nestled in the heart of this breathtaking landscape, far from the bustling streets of Billings and the tourist crowds of Yellowstone, lay the most impressive cattle ranch in the entire state. Mr. James Sterling, a tech billionaire who had made his fortune in Silicon Valley before retreating to the quiet isolation of Big Sky country, owned every acre of this vast estate that stretched as far as the eye could see. Sterling had always been a man of extremes, someone who collected the rare and the impossible. His mansion was filled with artifacts from around the world. His garage housed vintage cars worth more than most people's homes, and his ranch was home to the finest livestock money could buy. But there was one animal that had become his greatest obsession and his most dangerous possession. In the farthest corner of the property, surrounded by reinforced steel barriers and electric fencing that hummed with warning, lived Thunder, a massive black Angus bull whose reputation had spread throughout the ranching community like wildfire. This wasn't just any bull. Thunder stood over 6 feet tall at the shoulder, weighed nearly 3,000 pounds, and possessed a temperament so violent that even the most experienced cowboys refused to enter his enclosure. The animal had been rescued from an illegal fighting ring 3 years ago, his massive body bearing scars from countless battles, and his eyes holding a fury that seemed to burn from somewhere deep within his soul. Every attempt to rehabilitate him had failed spectacularly. 3 professional animal behaviorists had been hospitalized. 5 experienced bull riders had been carried away on stretchers, and countless ranch hands had quit rather than work anywhere near his enclosure. Yet Sterling refused to put the animal down, perhaps seeing something of himself in the bull's isolation and rage. On a particularly crisp October morning, as the golden aspen leaves danced in the mountain breeze, and the distant peaks of Glacier National Park gleamed white with fresh snow, Sterling stood before a gathering of reporters, ranchers, and thrill-seekers who had traveled from as far away as Texas and California to witness his latest proclamation. Dressed in his signature black suit and silver bolo tie, the billionaire's steel-gray eyes reflected the same cold determination that had built his empire. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying across the crisp mountain air, "I'm offering $1 million to anyone who can tame Thunder without using force or sedatives. Not just ride him, but truly calm him, make him trust again." The crowd murmured with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Everyone knew this wasn't about the money for Sterling. It was about proving that some things in this world were truly impossible, that some damage could never be undone. News of the challenge spread like wildfire across social media and local news stations, reaching from the ranches of Wyoming to the city streets of Denver and Seattle. Professional trainers, daredevils, and fortune seekers began planning their trips to Montana, all convinced they could be the one to claim the $1 million prize. But hundreds of miles away, in the narrow alleyways behind the Pike Place Market in Seattle, a 17-year-old girl named Chen was struggling to survive another day on the streets. She had been living rough since aging out of the foster care system 2 years ago, spending her days busking with an old guitar near the waterfront, and her nights finding shelter wherever she could. Sarah had always had an unusual gift with animals. Stray cats would follow her, injured birds would allow her to help them, and even the most aggressive dogs on the streets seemed to calm in her presence. She didn't understand it, and she'd never told anyone about it, but animals simply trusted her in a way that people never had. If this story of courage, determination, and the power of gentleness in a harsh world is drawing you in, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to discover how one girl's pure heart can change everything. Do you believe that true strength comes from force and dominance, or from understanding and compassion? Sarah had first heard about Sterling's challenge while sitting on the cold concrete steps outside Starbucks, Reserve Roastery in Capitol Hill, strumming her battered guitar for the handful of coins passers-by might drop into her worn baseball cap. 2 business executives in expensive suits had stopped to grab their morning coffee, their conversation drifting over to where she sat trying to stay warm in the early Seattle drizzle. "Did you see that crazy story out of Montana?" one of them had said, scrolling through his phone. "Some tech billionaire is offering $1 million to anyone who can calm a wild bull. Apparently, the thing is completely psychotic, Already put several people in the hospital." The other man laughed, shaking his head. "Probably some publicity stunt. No one's going to claim that money. Sounds like a death wish to me." But Sarah had stopped playing, her fingers frozen on the guitar strings as something deep inside her chest began to stir. She didn't care about the $1 million, not really. She couldn't even imagine that much money. What caught her attention was the idea of an animal that no one could reach, something so hurt and angry that it had given up on trusting anyone. That night, as she huddled under a tarp behind a dumpster in Pioneer Square, listening to the distant sound of fairy horns echoing across Puget Sound, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the bull. She remembered her grandmother's words from years ago, before the cancer took her and Sarah entered the foster system. "Animals don't forget love, sweetheart, but they don't forget pain either. Sometimes the angriest ones just need someone to sit with them until they remember they're not alone." By morning, Sarah had made a decision that would change her life forever. She gathered her few possessions, sold her guitar to a pawn shop for enough money to buy a Greyhound bus ticket, and began the long journey from the Pacific Northwest to the heart of Big Sky Country. The ride took 18 hours, winding through the Cascade Mountains, across the wheat fields of eastern Washington, and into the endless prairie of Montana. She changed buses in Spokane and again in Missoula, each mile taking her further from the only world she'd ever known. Her stomach growled with hunger, her back ached from the uncomfortable seats, and doubt gnawed at her mind, but something kept pushing her forward. When the bus finally pulled into the small town of Big Timber, Montana, Sarah felt as though she'd entered a different universe. The air was thinner here, crisp and clean in a way that made her lungs ache. The Rocky Mountains rose like cathedral spires against the endless blue sky, and everywhere she looked, she saw pickup trucks, cowboy hats, and people who moved with the confident stride of those who belonged to the land. Finding Sterling's ranch proved more difficult than she'd anticipated. The local diner where she stopped to ask directions was filled with ranchers and truckers who looked at her city clothes and obvious inexperience with barely concealed amusement. "You're not seriously thinking about going up there, are you, honey?" an elderly waitress asked, refilling coffee cups with practiced efficiency. "That bull has already hurt more folks than I can count." But Sarah wasn't deterred. She hitched a ride with a kind trucker who was delivering feed to a nearby ranch, then walked the final 5 miles along a dusty gravel road that seemed to stretch into infinity. Her feet were blistered in her worn sneakers, her lips were cracked from the dry mountain air, and her shoulders were sunburned despite the cool weather, but she kept walking. As the sun began to set behind the Absaroka Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that she'd never seen in the city, Sarah finally crested a small hill and saw Sterling's estate spread out before her. The main house was a massive log structure that looked like something out of a luxury magazine, surrounded by barns, corrals, and outbuildings that spoke of serious money and serious ranching. The security gate was manned by 2 guards in uniforms who looked at her approach with obvious skepticism. "What do you want, miss?" one of them asked, his hand resting casually on his radio. When Sarah explained why she'd come, both men burst into laughter that echoed across the valley. "You?" the second guard said, wiping tears from his eyes. "Honey, that bull would trample you before you even got close. Why don't you head back to wherever you came from before you get yourself killed?" But Sarah didn't leave. She set up camp just outside the gate, wrapping herself in the thin jacket she'd brought from Seattle and settling in for the night. The mountain cold bit through her clothes, coyotes howled in the distance, and the vast silence of the prairie felt almost overwhelming after a lifetime in the city. For 3 days she returned to the gate, politely asking to speak with Mr. Sterling, and being turned away each time. On the 4th morning, as the first light of dawn painted the peaks of the Beartooth Mountains in shades of rose and gold, one of the guards finally radioed the main house. "Sir," he said, his voice uncertain, "there's a girl here who's been coming back every day, says she wants to try with the bull. I know it sounds crazy, but she won't give up." There was a long pause, static crackling through the radio, before a cool voice responded, "Bring her up to the house. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Have you ever been so certain of something that you were willing to risk everything, even when everyone around you said it was impossible?" James Sterling's home office was a testament to his success and his isolation. filled with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the Absaroka wilderness, walls lined with awards from his tech empire, and a massive desk carved from a single piece of Montana pine. When Sarah entered the room, escorted by the skeptical security guards, she felt the weight of Sterling's gaze studying her with the same intensity he might have used to evaluate a business proposal. The billionaire was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with prematurely silver hair and eyes the color of glacier ice. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt that probably cost more than most people made in a month, but there was nothing soft about him. He moved with the controlled precision of someone who had never learned to lose, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "So you're the girl who's been camping at my gate," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "My security team tells me you want to attempt something that has already put professional trainers in the hospital. What makes you think you're different?" Sarah straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze without flinching, despite the intimidating surroundings. She thought of all the foster homes where she'd been dismissed, all the social workers who'd written her off, all the people who'd told her she wasn't worth the trouble. "I don't think I'm different, sir," she said quietly. "I just think maybe Thunder is tired of people trying to make him be something he's not." Sterling's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. "And what do you think he is?" "Scared," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Hurt. Probably convinced that every human who comes near him wants to cause him pain. I know what that feels like." For a long moment, the office was silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the fields. Sterling walked to the window that overlooked the corrals, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the landscape that had become his refuge from the world. "I bought Thunder from a raid on an illegal fighting operation," he said finally, his voice softer than before. "The authorities were going to put him down, said he was too dangerous to save. I thought I could prove them wrong, that money and resources could fix anything. 3 years later, he's more isolated than ever." He turned back to Sarah, and for a moment she saw something vulnerable flicker behind his ice blue eyes. "Why do you really want to do this? It's not about the money, is it?" "No, sir," Sarah said. "I don't even know what I'd do with $1 million. I've been invisible my whole life. People look through me or they see a problem to be solved. But animals see me. They trust me. And if Thunder has forgotten how to trust, maybe I can help him remember." Sterling studied her for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. Finally, he walked to his desk and picked up a photograph that sat in a simple wooden frame. The picture showed a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, sitting on a farm fence with his arm around a golden retriever. Both the boy and the dog were smiling. "That's me with my dog Ranger, taken at my grandfather's farm in Nebraska," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the only photograph I have where I look truly happy. Animals understood me then, before I learned that trust was a luxury I couldn't afford." He set the photograph down and looked at Sarah with new intensity. "If I let you try this and Thunder hurts you, I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the fear that was beginning to creep up her spine. "I've never been more certain of anything." Sterling nodded slowly, then pressed a button on his desk intercom. "Have the handlers prepare the South Corral," he said, "and get Dr. Matthews on standby. We're going to need medical personnel nearby." He stood and walked toward the door, pausing to look back at Sarah one last time. "Thunder hasn't allowed anyone within 50 feet of him in over a year," he said. "If you can get close enough to touch him without force or sedatives, the $1 million is yours. But if you change your mind at any point, no one will think less of you." As they walked across the ranch toward the distant corral, where Thunder waited, Sarah felt the weight of every choice that had led her to this moment. The mountain air filled her lungs. The vast sky stretched endlessly above her, and somewhere ahead, a broken animal waited for someone to prove that the world could still be kind. Do you think some wounds are too deep to heal, or can love and patience overcome even the most profound trauma? Word that Sterling had agreed to let the young homeless girl attempt the impossible had spread quickly throughout the ranch, and by the time they reached the South Corral, a small crowd had gathered. Ranch hands leaned against the fence rails. Veterinarians checked their equipment, and even the cook from the main house had come out to witness what many expected to be a tragedy in the making. The corral itself was built like a fortress, with reinforced steel barriers that rose, 12 feet high and thick wooden posts that had been sunk deep into the Montana hardpan. In the center of this arena stood a structure that looked more like a prison cell than an animal enclosure, with bars thick enough to contain a creature of Thunder's size and strength. Sterling positioned himself on an elevated platform that offered a clear view of the entire corral, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Beside him, Dr. Matthews, the ranch's veterinarian, had a tranquilizer gun ready, though everyone knew that if things went wrong, there might not be time to use it. When the handlers finally opened the gate to Thunder's holding pen, the very air seemed to change. The bull emerged like a force of nature, his massive black form moving with surprising grace despite his size. He stood nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, and the scars that crisscrossed his hide told the story of a life filled with violence and pain. His eyes, dark as Montana coal, swept across the gathered crowd with an intelligence that was both captivating and terrifying. When his gaze settled on Sarah, who stood quietly by the gate, wearing her worn jeans and faded Seattle Sounders T-shirt, Thunder's massive head lowered, and a low rumble emerged from deep within his chest. Sarah entered the corral slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She carried nothing with her, no ropes or tools or treats, just the same quiet confidence that had served her well on the streets of Seattle when dealing with aggressive dogs and frightened cats. She walked to the center of the arena and then simply sat down in the dirt, cross-legged, her hands resting loosely in her lap. Thunder watched her with the intensity of a predator, his muscles coiled and ready to charge. The spectators held their breath, every person present understanding that they were witnessing something that could go terribly wrong in an instant. But Sarah showed no fear, no tension. She simply sat and waited, her gaze directed not at the bull, but at the distant mountains, as if giving him space to study her without feeling challenged. Minutes passed like hours. Thunder paced the perimeter of the corral, his hooves throwing up small clouds of dust with each step. He would approach to within 20 feet of Sarah, then veer away, his massive head swinging back and forth as he tried to understand this strange human who posed no threat but also showed no fear. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the bull's movements began to slow. His breathing became less labored, his posture less aggressive. Sarah remained motionless, a small figure in the vast arena, connected to the animal by something deeper than words or gestures. After what felt like an eternity, Thunder approached to within 10 feet of where Sarah sat. He stood there, his great chest rising and falling, his dark eyes studying every detail of this curious human who had invaded his territory but made no demands upon him. Very slowly, Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out an apple she had taken from the ranch kitchen earlier that morning. She placed it on the ground between them and then returned her hands to her lap, her movements so gentle they barely disturbed the air around her. Thunder's nostrils flared as he caught the scent of the fruit. He took one cautious step forward, then another, until he was close enough that Sarah could feel the warmth radiating from his massive body. With delicate precision, he lowered his head and picked up the apple, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. As he chewed, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere of the corral. The tension that had gripped every spectator began to ease, replaced by a sense of wonder at what they were witnessing. Thunder, the bull that no one could approach, was standing peacefully beside a teenage girl who had asked for nothing more than his trust. Sarah slowly extended her hand, palm up, and waited. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Thunder studied her outstretched fingers. Then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature of his size, he lowered his massive head and allowed her to touch his muzzle. The contact was electric, a connection that transcended species and spoke to something fundamental about the capacity for healing and trust. Sarah's fingers traced the scars on Thunder's face, and in that moment, both broken souls found something they had long thought lost. When Sterling finally approached the fence, his voice was hoarse with emotion. "You did it," he said, his words carrying across the silent arena. "The $1 million is yours." Sarah looked up at him, her hand still resting on Thunder's neck, and shook her head. I don't want the money, she said quietly. I want something better. I want to stay here, take care of Thunder, and maybe learn how to help other animals like him. I want to go to college and become a veterinarian. Sterling stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Done, he said. You'll have your own cabin on the ranch, full tuition to Montana State University, and a job here for as long as you want it. That night, as Sarah slept in a real bed for the first time in years, Thunder stood quietly in the corral outside her window, his dark eyes peaceful for the first time in memory. And in the main house, Sterling sat holding the photograph of himself and Ranger, finally understanding that some things were more valuable than money and that healing could come from the most unexpected places. Do you believe that everyone and everything deserves a second chance, no matter how broken they might seem?